Hi everyone, and welcome to the weekly video for Legal Research Week 5. Now, we're sitting in a sort of an interesting position here of in-betweens. I realise at this point you guys will be madly finishing off your plans and analysis for your first assignment. We're also at a bit of a transition in the course between the first phase, which was really about preparing those plans and looking at how you actually structure the foundations of the research process. And the next phase that we're going into is looking at all the different types of research source in depth and looking at how you use them and what you can and can't do with a case as opposed to a news article or a piece of statistical research. So we're sort of in between things, and we've also got, of course, in the gap between Unit 5 and Unit 6, the mid-semester break, which will mean different things to different people. For a lot of you, it won't mean any kind of break at all, because you're still, got your same obligations outside of uni, but at least it's a notional break there. All right, so this week sits in between there, and I want to talk a little bit about the idea of ethics in terms of research ethics. Now, at this point, you may or may not have already done the legal ethics subject, but these are two different areas of ethics, but they do have some connection between them. And research ethics really has two very different aspects to it. And this is the code of ethics that researchers agree to abide by. It also means that institutions all have an ethics process where if you want to do any primary research out there in the world, you have to apply for permission from an ethics committee in order to do it. And this is due to a whole background of different abuses, particularly in the scientific and medical communities throughout the 20th century, and the perceived need that was never perceived before to actually put some restrictions, particularly when people are dealing with serious medical issues. So there are effectively two sides to the research ethics issue. On the one side, there is the general public good idea of, in the medical parlance, do no harm, that as researchers we should not be doing any further harm or any kind of harm in the exercise of our business, and we need to be sensitive that we're dealing, particularly with human research, with real people and real lives. The flip side of that sort of works with it is the idea of risk mitigation, and universities desperately not wanting to get sued for doing that harm. And I guess that's a puzzle for you guys to all think about as lawyers is, do people do the right thing because they're good people, or do the right thing because they're afraid of being punished? And there's really the two sides of that comes very strongly into research ethics. So there's a national code of ethical conduct, which is referred to in the study guide, and there are processes at the university level whenever you want to do primary research, because you folks won't be doing primary research at undergraduate level. But if you go on to do honours, you may want to do that. You may want to do some interviews, you may want to do some surveys and those sort of things. And the other reason why it's very important for you is it helps you understand when you're looking at secondary research, when you're looking at what other people have published, it helps you think how that research project was designed and what the limitations were. And this is particularly true in the topic that we're looking at this term in terms of anything around child victims. In particular, I mean, that's probably the most sensitive area to actually work through. And a lot of the things where we've got gaps in information, and the question is, how many, even something simple as how many children are victims of abuse in institutional context, easiest way to answer that would be just go out and ask them all. But of course, there's ethical problems with that, and you've got problems with, asking a child who's in a care situation, hey, has anything terrible happened to you, and then putting them straight back into that situation, knowing that they've spoken to an outside party. There's all sorts of other issues around that person's privacy in terms of what that process will do to them developmentally, and so on and so forth. So of all the areas of law reform that I've ever used in this subject over about 20 years, this is probably the one where the ethical issues are clearest and most obvious to see. You know, we've done one about, I've done this in areas of obscure areas of evidence law, and then it sometimes is a bit hard to convince people that like this ethics stuff is so serious and life and death when it's this sort of minor technical area of law. This area, yeah, I think everyone gets it very clearly. So the workshop this week asks you to imagine a part of your research that would benefit from some form of primary research. Again, you're not going to be doing it. It's purely a thought experiment. And then to think through the low risk and high risk aspects of the ethics application. And what we will work through is what sorts of things you need to discuss and what sort of things you would need to talk about in an ethics application. We'll be looking at a low risk ethics application, because high risk applications are extremely difficult and complicated. It doesn't mean they don't get done, because you do need at times for people like psychologists to work with traumatized children. It's not the fact that just because it's a dangerous and ethically risky situation that we don't do the research, but we do need to have a lot of that was the dog, if you heard that. We do need to have procedures in place to prevent harm taking place, and if there's a high risk of harm, those procedures are pretty serious. Now, what we'll be looking at here is a situation where there are low risk applications, which would be the kind of research that you wouldn't be doing anywhere near an actual victim, but who you could be interviewing, for instance, is someone who is in a reporting agency, possibly someone who works in a care facility, provided you couldn't go too far. That one might be a little bit more risky, but certainly you could interview some social workers about their experience. You could interview people from the Child Protection Agency. You could involve some kind of survey of out-of-home carers that didn't actually look at abuse issues, that looked at more general information about out-of-home carers. That sort of thing would be feasible. So we'll look at the rules. And we'll particularly look at our university rules around ethics and that sort of ethics application. I'll do one as usual from the question 1 perspective, and then you can just do it from your own. Now the documents, of course, are quite copious. You're not going to have to do that for a weekly task. You just have to make a few notes, maybe half a page of notes of identifying what you think is the risk areas and what are the things you could do to protect against that risk. So we'll go through all that one in class. In the workshop, and fill you in more on that, and we'll be looking at the older application process at CQ, which I've referred to in the notes, because the new process is 100% online, which is nice in theory, but it means I can't actually show you the process without creating a new application. And if I create a fake application in the system, people will lose their mind, because I probably won't be able to delete it, and there'll probably be people wondering what this weird research is, and so on and so forth. So the old system was paper based, and you just filled in a Word doc and sent it back. We'll have a look at what goes on there. So it's not a very difficult week. Appreciating that you've got other things that you are focusing on right now, but it's an important one to connect with and think about. All right, what else did I have to talk about this week? I mentioned the upcoming assignment. I'm sure you know about that 100%. I'll put some consult times on early next week if you need a hand, but if you've looked at last week's workshop video, I think you'll have an idea of what's involved. It's just a case of working through what you've got, and it's not an assignment that has a fixed template to work from or anything like that. We're not expecting anything in a certain format, except that you have your name on it and you have your question number on it, and apart from that, that's all you need to have. And it's really about us showing you showing us your process and getting some feedback on it. I know we don't do that very often. I know this has been a kind of a really unusual activity, but ideally your work in a subject should build and this is just a clear way in which you can actually see the process that the early assignments build towards the next ones. And it's because it's a research subject, it's easier to do that in a clear way. Okay, your reading this week. I've given you the ethical guidelines from the Australian Code of Responsible Conduct of Research to have a look at. Have a look at that. Don't read it or memorise it in depth, but one thing to think about is, why is a code of conduct different to a piece of legislation? Because they look similar, and in fact in some ways they operate similarly, but we are increasingly moving into a world, you'll probably remember this from admin law, where we are governed by regulation, and some of that is self-regulation. And for every one piece of legislation that's out there, there's 100 or 1,000, I don't know, different codes of practice, sub-regulations, individual standards that also connect into that regulatory network. And this is one of those reasons why people with law qualifications are increasingly valuable, even though the legal profession itself is sort of winding down in many ways. But having people who can work with regulation becomes really important. You can't work in a cafe now without having a certificate in hand washing. You have to wash your hands in a certain way, using a certain process. We're in a world that is just filled with these legalistic rules, even if they aren't what we would conventionally recognise as laws. Anyway, so the reading's there for you to have a look at what a code of practice looks like, and to think about the differences and similarities with standard law. And the equilibrium content this week is thinking about the ethical conduct in terms of responsibility to the people you work with and to yourself, in terms of what is the ethic of care around being a researcher, and what are the ways in which we focus a lot on the impact on the subjects of a research process and the community outside. But what does it mean to be an ethically good person in the way in which you just deal with others, and, as I said, also yourself, when you approach and plan research projects. Okay, that's about all I have to say this week, and I will see you in Tutes next week.